بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is our 37th lesson in the series on the book Al-Uboodiyyah of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. In the previous lesson we spoke about al-istikbar, which is arrogance, pride and arrogance, and how this pride and arrogance is the opposite of al-istislam. Al-istislam is the inward submission, the inward acknowledgement that one is a servant of Allah and that one is must submit and worship his Lord and be grateful. So this is an inward submission, an inward acknowledgement. This is al-istislam. And the opposite of this is al-istikbar. And al-istikbar is pride and arrogance, which prevents a person from entering into submission to Allah and into worship, into ibadah. And the point at which we finished the previous lesson was the statement of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, where he said, وَكُلُّ مُسْتَكْبِرٍ فَهُوَ مُشْرِكٌ وَكُلُّ مُسْتَكْبِرٍ فَهُوَ مُشْرِكٌ. Everyone who is pride and arrogant, and he arrogantly refuses to worship Allah Azza wa Jal, then he is counted as a mushrik. He is also a polytheist. He is a worshipper of other than Allah. So how can this be? And so this is what we are going to elaborate upon, inshallah ta'ala, in the continuation of the discussion. So from the previous lesson, we finished with, I believe, the speech of Sheikh Salih al-Fawzan, and he said, وَالْإِسْتِكْبَارُ وَالشِّرْكُ مُتَلَازِمَانِ, which means that pride and arrogance and shirk are two issues which are binding to each other. If there's arrogance, if there's pride and arrogance, by necessity there will be shirk. And by shirk, the worship of others, the setting up of partners with Allah Azza wa Jal in His worship. So he said, فَالْمُسْتَكْبِرْ إِمَّا أَن يَكُونَ مُسْتَكْبِرًا لَا يَعْبُدُ شَيْئًا. So the mustakbir, we said the one who's arrogant and full of pride, he's one of two types of people. Either he worships nothing, he does not worship anything at all. So this would be, the atheist or the materialist or the naturalist. Or وَإِمَّا أَن يَكُونَ مُسْتَكْبِرًا مُشْرِكًا يَعْبُدُ غَيْرَ اللَّهِ فَيَكُونُ مُسْتَكْبِرًا مُشْرِكًا. Or he is someone who is mustakbir, he's arrogant, and he worships other than Allah, and he refuses to make his worship only for Allah. So this would be a polytheist, a grave worshipper, an idol worshipper, right? So he worships other things besides Allah, and when he is called and invited, he refuses to single out Allah with worship, right? So this now is arrogance at this particular point. One is arrogance in not worshipping Allah at all, and one is arrogance in not singling out Allah Azza wa Jal in worship. And so obviously to either of these two people, there are the relative arguments and proofs and evidences that the messengers came with. But the point being here, that arrogance can apply to either of these two situations, in both of these two situations. So after that, Shaykh al-Fawzan went on to discuss the atheists who deny a Lord outwardly, whereas inwardly they actually acknowledge that there must be a Lord. And we spoke about this, I think, at the end of the previous lesson, so we won't repeat that discussion again. But where we want to lead into is where Ibn Taymiyyah makes a point now, after we establish that every mustakbir, everyone who has pride and arrogance, then he is by necessity a mushrik, right? He is an associationist, he is a polytheist. And then Ibn Taymiyyah says, وَلِهَذَا كَانَ فِرْعَوْنُ مِنْ أَعْظَمِ الْخَلْقِ اسْتِكْبَارًا عَنْ إِبَادَةِ اللَّهِ وَكَانَ مُشْرِكًا. For this reason, Fir'aun, the Pharaoh Fir'aun, was from the greatest of the creation in arrogance, in being arrogant away from worshipping Allah, right? His arrogance towards worshipping Allah. And he was a mushrik, and he was also a mushrik, meaning a polytheist at the same time. So Shaykh al-Fawzan comments upon this sentence here, and he says, Fir'aun, why was Fir'aun a mushrik? Why was he a polytheist? He was a polytheist, a mushrik, because he claimed rububiyyah for himself, right? He made himself to be a partner with Allah. But sometimes you make somebody to be a partner with Allah, as you see the Christians do with Isa ibn Maryam and others whom they worship. They're the ones who did that. Right? They erected their own deity. And there are some people who make themselves, like in this case Fir'aun, he made himself to be a Lord alongside Allah Azza wa Jal. So he made himself to be a sharik, a partner to Allah. So he is himself a polytheist, right? He's a mushrik himself. As he said, as Allah Azza wa Jal mentions about him, that he said, Ana rabbukumul a'la. This is what Fir'aun said to his people, Ana rabbukumul a'la. I am your Lord Most High. As we see in Surah An-Nazi'at, the 79th Surah, verse number 24. Alongside this, he knows full well, deep inside his own soul, he knows inwardly, deep inside his own self, that there is no Lord, there is no Creator except Allah Azza wa Jal. But what carried him to proclaim this was purely arrogance and transgression. Purely arrogance and transgression. And, to that end, he made himself to be a partner with Allah Azza wa Jal in his rububiyyah. Then after this, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he goes on to mention a series of verses, we'll read through them bit by bit, which mention the story of Fir'aun and the arrogance of Fir'aun. So from those verses is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا مُوسَى بِآيَاتِنَا وَسُلْطَانٍ مُبِينٍ. We indeed sent Moses with clear signs and an authoritative argument, a clear argument, clear proof. إِلَى فِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَقَارُونَ فَقَالُوا سَاحِرٌ كَذَّابٌ. We sent him to Fir'aun and Haman, who is the minister, and Qarun, who is another person with Fir'aun. And they responded and said, he is a lying magician. And then the story continues, many verses in between, up until we come later on in the chapter, in which Musa alayhi salam, he says, وَقَالَ مُوسَى إِنِّي عُذْتُ بِرَبِّي وَرَبِّكُمْ مِنْ كُلِّ مُتَكَبِّرٍ لَا يُؤْمِنُ بِيَوْمِ الْحِسَابِ. He said, indeed, Musa said, I seek refuge with my Lord and your Lord from every arrogant one who does not believe in the day of accounting. In the day of accounting. And likewise, it continues in the same chapter, Surah Al-Ghafir. كَذَلِكَ يَطْبَعُ اللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ قَلْبٍ مُتَكَبِّرٍ جَبَّارٍ. Thus does Allah seal the heart of does he seal every heart of the mutakabbir, the one who's arrogant and jabbar, who is, tyrannical. And likewise, he also said, in another chapter, Surah Al-Ankabut, وَقَارُونَ وَفِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مُوسَى بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ فَاسْتَكْبَرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَمَا كَانُوا سَابِقِينَ. So he said, likewise Qarun and Fir'aun and Haman, Moses indeed came to them with clear evidences, but they became arrogant upon the earth, and they are not, they will not precede us. And likewise, another verse, Surah Al-Qasas, إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ عَلَى فِي الْأَرْضِ وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا يَسْتَضْعِفُ طَائِفَةً مِّنْهُمْ يُذَبِّحُ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ وَيَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُمْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. Indeed, Fir'aun, he became, he basically took authority on the earth, meaning he became powerful and considered himself to be high and mighty. And he made the people, he split the people into different factions. And he would, make some of them to be, he would weaken some of them, impoverish them and weaken them. And he would slaughter their children and leave alive their women. Indeed, he was from the people of mischief, the people who did mischief. So these are just some passages that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah has brought, and you can see that the common theme in all of these passages is that these people, Fir'aun and the prominent people with him, his minister Haman and Qarun, they were very arrogant and they denied the evidences and the proofs, and they committed mischief upon the earth, and they sought authority upon the earth. And so in relation to these verses that we've just read, we see that Shaykh al-Fawzan, he mentions that this story of Musa and Fir'aun, Allah Azza wa Jal has mentioned it. In fact, this is the story that is most frequently mentioned in the Quran. Of all of the stories, of all of the 25 or so prophets which are mentioned in the Quran, the most frequently repeated and the one recounted over and over again, and which is found in so many different chapters of the Quran. It's spread, from the beginning to the end of the Quran. It's the most frequently repeated, story in the Quran. And the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, he is the most frequently mentioned prophet or messenger in the Quran. So obviously there are tremendous lessons to be drawn from this story. So he says that this story has been mentioned in many places in the Quran, for admonishment and for lesson and for reflection. And from these, and then the Shaykh refers to the verses that we've just been through, and he comments upon each verse. And so I won't go through all the verses again. I'll just quickly summarize, the commentary of the Shaykh. And so he says that Musa alayhi salam was sent with clear evidences and clear proof. Right, so the ayat are these are things that you see and you observe. So Fir'aun was shown certain things, certain ayat, to show to him that these are the workings of Allah Azza wa Jal through his prophet and messenger. They are not things that any man can do of his own accord. Right, so these are visible signs and ayat, like the 9 things that he was shown. With the staff and the hand, and then those various other things that were sent, the plagues and the things like that. And likewise, وَسُلْطَانٍ مُبِينٍ, which is hujjah zahira, which is like evidence, argument, proof. Right? So these 2 things were presented to Fir'aun. And obviously he responded that he is a magician, a liar, a lying magician. And this rejection on their behalf wasn't because they had any proof or evidence or any standing. It was pure arrogance. Pure arrogance. If you find this hard to believe, let me give you an example to show how this can happen, like in everyday common occurrences. So imagine you give somebody a loan of £1,000 or something. And you say, okay, you owe me this after a month. And then after a month, the time comes and you go to this person, you say, right, the time's come, you agreed you owe me £1,000. So he now starts to deny that he owes you £1,000. Right. This is what we call juhud. Right. In Arabic language, juhud. Juhud means rejection after knowledge. Rejection after knowledge. It means you know full well, yet you are still making a rejection. So here in this example, this person clearly knows he owes you £1,000. He clearly knows, he's not ignorant, he knows, and yet he's making juhud, right? Now, what's the reason? What's the reason why he's making juhud? What's the reason? It could be different reasons, but one of the reasons is arrogance, right? Just pure arrogance. It could be greed, right? It could be trying to be high and mighty, thinking that you are beyond paying back someone, that you are so high and mighty you can get away with these types of things, right? So there are people who think like this, and in this case, the rejection of Fir'aun was not on the basis of any knowledge. It was pure arrogance. And so this is why Musa alayhi salam, he said, "Inni a'udhtu bi Rabbi wa Rabbikum min kulli mutakabbirin la yu'minu bi yawmil hisab." Indeed, I seek refuge in my Lord and your Lord from every arrogant person who does not believe in the day of accounting. So, clearly these people who know that they are wrong and know that they, like this person I just gave in the example, he knows he owes you £1,000. He's refusing to give it to you out of arrogance and pride, right? Or for whatever reason it might be. And so here, it's very suitable to make the supplication, "I seek refuge in my Lord and your Lord from every arrogant person who doesn't believe in the day in the accounting. He's not fearful of being held to account." And so he goes around, arrogant. So this is the statement of Musa alayhi salam. They were inhibited from following Musa alayhi salam because of their arrogance, despite them knowing inwardly, deep inside their souls, that Allah Azza wa Jal, He is the Lord, He is the Creator, and He is deserving of worship. And likewise, when Musa alayhi salam, he showed Fir'aun the various signs, all the very signs that I mentioned, he said, قَالَ لَقَدْ عَلِمْتَ مَا أَنزَلَ هَؤُلَاءِ إِلَّا رَبُّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ بَصَائِرِ. He said, indeed you know full well that these various signs that were sent down, no one sent them except the Lord of the heavens and the earth, as evidences. Indeed I consider you, وَإِنِّي لَأَظُنُّكَ يَا فِرْعَوْنَ مَثْبُورًا. Indeed I consider you, O Fir'aun, to be one who is destroyed. And also the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, He said, وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُمْ ظُلْمًا وَعُلُوًّا. That they, meaning the people of Fir'aun, they rejected the signs even though their souls were convinced thereof, out of arrogance and being haughty and trying to be high and mighty in the earth. So in other words, outwardly they denied the signs, inwardly they were convinced of the signs, and as the Shaykh says, وَالْجُحُودِ إِنَّمَا يَكُونُ لِشَيْءٍ مَعْلُومٍ بِسَبَبِ الظُّلْمِ وَالْعُلُوِّ وَالْإِسْتِكْبَارِ. Indeed, juhud means rejection. This is in relation to something that is known. You're denying something that is known, right? And it is due to either dhulm, oppression, or ulu, trying to be, seeking to be high and mighty, or istikbar, or arrogance, right? So you either intend deliberately to oppress a person, you want to oppress that person, just like in the example I gave you, not giving back the loan that you took. Now you are oppressing that person, right? You desire to oppress, or it is arrogance, or it is, ulu, trying to be high and mighty, haughty. Likewise, the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal when He said, كَذَلِكَ يَطْبَعُ اللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ قَلْبٍ مُتَكَبِّرٍ جَبَّارٍ. Thus does Allah seal the heart of every the heart of every arrogant, proud, tyrannical one. So this is a punishment that Allah Azza wa Jal, He seals a person's heart from ever seeing or coming to the truth. Why? Because that heart itself is refusing to see the truth. Because of its arrogance, because of its pride. So the heart then becomes sealed, because this is something that the heart has chosen. And so Allah seals the heart of that person, and thus, no matter how many evidences you show, no matter how much proof you show, no matter how much clarity you bring, a person is not willing to accept the truth. And so this you find with many of the people of disbelief, many of the atheists and the naturalists and people like that, until some of them actually openly admit this themselves. We've mentioned this before previously, in previous lessons, that some of them are very open and they say, look, when we reject a creator and we believe only in materialism and we believe only in material causes, it's not because we have any proof. It's not because we have any proof. It's not because we have any scientific proof. We can't bring any. This is purely something that's just philosophical from us. Because philosophically speaking, we prefer a world which doesn't have a God, doesn't have a creator. It just makes us feel better, and it makes us operate better in a world where we don't have this creator in our mind. We just prefer it to be like that. Not that we have any evidence or anything like that. So you can see that some of these people, they readily admit that this has got nothing to do with like science or proof that they have or evidence that they have to deny a creator. It's something that they just simply prefer as a matter of choice, basically based upon their whims and their desires. They don't like to be told what to do. They don't like to be told this is right, this is wrong. They don't like to make observances. They don't like to follow a moral code. This is what it basically comes down to. Not that it's a matter of evidence and proof and so they readily admit. Some of them are open and frank enough to make this admission. But obviously there are others who are arrogant and try to pretend as if they have some sort of evidence or argument, and they don't really have anything. So as for the other people that were mentioned in these verses, we mentioned Fir'aun, we mentioned Haman, we mentioned Qarun. Who are these people? Haman is the minister. He is the minister of Fir'aun. Qarun is someone who's actually from Bani Israel. He was from the children of Israel. But in this empire of Fir'aun, he became a very rich and wealthy person, a very rich and wealthy man. And he was considered to be a person of tremendous wealth and cultivation and of power and authority. And this led him to transgression and arrogance on account of his wealth. And Fir'aun was obviously the king, the leader. Haman was the minister, and Qarun was just a very, very wealthy person. And Fir'aun said to Haman, he said, "Ya Haman ibn li sarhan la'alli ablugh al-asbab." O Haman, build for me a structure that I may reach the ways. Asbab as-samawati fa'attali'a ila ilahi Musa. That I may ascend the heavens, and so that I may come upon the ilah of Musa. This is now like a very arrogant statement where Fir'aun is saying that this claim that you are making, O Musa, of this Lord of yours, I'm going to build a structure and ascend, and I'm going to see if I can come across this so-called Lord of yours, right? So this is again a very, very arrogant statement he's saying this from the angle of kibr. Even though he inwardly knows that this creation most certainly has a creator, because in the Quran, there are many other conversations that are described that Musa alayhi salam has with Fir'aun, in which he presents him clear evidences. And after all of those, it's clear that Fir'aun is just simply being arrogant. And in fact, what Fir'aun requested, you see even today, these very arrogant people, these very rich, affluent people, like you have these people like, I guess it's people like, what's his name? Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and, what's the other guy, the one who, Virgin, Branson. They all have these programs. They're obviously very, very tremendously wealthy, very, very rich, powerful people. And it's kind of like a status to go very, very, very high into the sky as a sign of, power and might and arrogance and things like that. And when they go up there, they say, well, there's nothing up there. It's all there is, we didn't see anything. There's nothing up there, and there's this connection here of trying to go above and to disprove that there is a creator. All of this is just a manifestation of the arrogance of these people, and they deny the very clear, apparent evidences they see in front of their own eyes, on a daily basis, which they experience, which they benefit from, which are inside their own souls. The workings of the body and the various phenomenon that everybody witnesses and sees. These are very apparent, obvious signs which are close to you, and so they deny these evident signs, and which are bayyinat and basair and ayat and so on and so forth. Clear evidence as signs. They reject them, and arrogance. It's pride and arrogance that overtakes them, and leads them into this type of display of their wealth and their power and their apparent authority. All right, so these are the kind of traits that these people have. So as Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا سَبَقُوا إِنَّهُمْ لَا يُعْجِزُونَ. Do not think that those who disbelieve are going to outreaches or going to precede us, meaning escape from us. Indeed, they innahum la yu'jizun. They're not capable. So then the Shaykh continues to discuss some of the other verses that we mentioned along the same lines about the arrogance of Fir'aun and how he would oppress the people. So anyway, after all of these passages, what's the point behind all of this? The point from all of this is to illustrate by way of Fir'aun and his example and his story, who is the most arrogant of the people of the earth, and to show that arrogance is connected to shirk. And the reason behind that is that the more and more a person is arrogant, the more he thinks himself to be free of need from a Lord and from a Creator. Right? And the more he considers himself to be free of need from his Lord and Creator, he will be more and more in need of things from the creation to sustain his arrogance and his power. Right? And thus he will increase more and more in his shirk. And so this is a point that will be brought out and elaborated upon in what is to follow in the speech of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah. So he says, Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, وَقَدْ وُصِفَ فِرْعَوْنُ بِالشِّرْكِ فِي قَوْلِهِ وَقَالَ الْمَلَأُ مِنْ قَوْمِ فِرْعَوْنِ أَتَذَرُ مُوسَى وَقَوْمَهُ لِيُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَيَذَرَكَ وَآلِهَتَكَ. Right, so here is a verse in the Quran, and what happened is that the leaders or the elite of the people who are in Fir'aun's court and his political circle, they said to Fir'aun, are you going to leave Moses, are you going to leave him alone and his people to commit this corruption in the earth? Meaning that they are disobeying you and they are calling to this message of worshipping Allah. Are you going to just leave them and let them do what they are doing and to abandon you and to abandon your gods? So here when they said, وَيَذَرَكَ وَآلِهَتَكَ, and to abandon you and your gods, this is evidence here in the Quran, right here, that Fir'aun had gods. Right? There were gods that were being served. So this is an evidence that not only was Fir'aun a caller to himself and a worshipper to himself, so he's a mushrik in that respect, but there were also deities which he had as well, which he wouldn't allow the people to abandon. Right? And in fact, when you go to the tafsir, you find that there's actually a hierarchy of gods, and you worship a different god, and before you can even reach Fir'aun, you have to go through these different deities. So there's like a whole hierarchy of gods that were present. So, commenting upon this, the Shaykh al-Fawzan, he says, in general, first of all, he says that in the Quran we see that Allah Azza wa Jal has spoken about tyrants and transgressors such as Nimrod, with Ibrahim alayhi salam, is a very arrogant tyrant. And likewise, the pagans of Quraysh and how they behaved with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Quraysh was the best of the tribes, and they were in charge of trade and commerce in Mecca, right? And so they showed arrogance and pride. And in the Quran, this is frequent, and we see Allah Azza wa Jal describing the end result of all of these people, and how the end result is for the believers, for the muttaqeen, in every age, in every era. And this simply requires striving, jihad and sabr, and patience, and anticipating victory and help from Allah Azza wa Jal, and not despairing. These are some of the traits and the qualities that the believer has, and eventually Allah will give him, will give them victory. But coming now to this verse that we just discussed, in this verse, there's two ways you can read this verse, right? So this verse is in Surah Al-A'raf, Surah 7, verse 127. So as we said at the end, the elites from the people of Fir'aun, they said, are you going to leave Musa and his people commit mischief and to abandon you, وَيَذَرَكَ وَآلِهَتَكَ, and your gods, وَآلِهَتَكَ. You can either read it وَآلِهَتَكَ, which means and your gods. Aliha is the plural of ilah. Or it can be read another way, وَإِلَهَتَكَ, which means and your worship, right? So it can either mean to abandon you and your gods, or it can mean to abandon you and your worship, to abandon you and worshipping you, right? Both of these meanings, it can also be read in that way. So the point being here, that upon the second reading of this verse, it was clear that Fir'aun was taken as a lord. They used to worship him. He would make them worship himself. And, they would also love him with a type of love where they took him as a lord. And all of this is shirk with Allah Azza wa Jal. And, he committed shirk himself by making himself a deity. And likewise, his people as well would worship him. If you think this type of thing is ancient and bygone and doesn't happen anymore, you couldn't be more wrong. You just have to look at a place like China, right? And you look at these people in China, how they've been brainwashed to worship the leader. They have pictures of him everywhere, and they have to give blind obedience, and they are inculcated with this kind of blind type of love and veneration, right? This thing hasn't become, bygone and, ancient and never to be seen again in a modern, enlightened, society, so to speak. No, it is present. It is present. And, coming to the point, from this is that Ibn Taymiyyah, after mentioning this verse, he then says, بل استقراء يدل على أنه كلما كان الرجل أعظم استكبارا عن عبادة الله كان أعظم إشراكا بالله. He says that when we look comprehensively from experience and investigation, we find that every time a man becomes greater in his arrogance towards worshipping Allah, he will become greater in his shirk with Allah. And he then goes on to, I'll come back to that statement, but Shaykh al-Fawzan comments and he says, whoever follows all of the stories and the stories of the nations that came before, when we look at various nations, how they got destroyed and their leaders, and how the leaders lost touch with reality and they became more and more arrogant, and eventually their nation got destroyed. When you study these people and you study these histories, you will come to know exactly the same point. Every time a person becomes greater in his takabbur, his arrogance, then he just fell into greater and greater, shirk with Allah Azza wa Jal. And what's the reason behind this? The reason behind this is explained by Ibn Taymiyyah. So he says, لأنه كلما استكبر عن عبادة الله ازداد فقره وحاجته إلى المراد المحبوب الذي هو المقصود مقصود القلب بالقصد الأول فيكون مشركا بما استعبده من ذلك ولن يستغني القلب عن جميع المخلوقات إلا بأن يكون الله هو مولاه الذي لا يعبد إلا إياه, to the end. Alright, so what is he saying in this, in these sentences? What Ibn Taymiyyah basically just said is along the following lines. He says, every time a person becomes more and more arrogant from worshipping Allah, then his need, of whatever he is seeking, with his heart, right, he will become more and more captivated by that need. And in order to reach that need, his heart will have to depend more and more of things besides Allah, whether that is wealth, whether that is assistance, helpers, allies, possessions. Like basically, it's like, if you want to be a great tyrant and you are arrogant away from worshipping Allah, well, what do you need to become a tyrant? Well, you need wealth, first of all. You need weapons, you need soldiers, you need armies, you need territory, you need loyal people, and obviously to win them and to gain them, your heart has to depend upon them, because obviously it can't be depending upon Allah, because you reject servitude to Allah. And so the entire structure of your power, your whole power structure, it relies upon other people, because at the end of the day you are just one man. What can you do? You're just one man. What can one man do on his own? Right? You as a tyrant, you need armies, you need ministers, you need allies, you need loyalty, you need wealth, you need all of these things you need to be under your command. So your reliance is going to be, your heart therefore is going to be attached to those things because it needs them and relies upon them. So you have now become a greater, like the shirk in your case is greater and greater and greater. Right? So the more you are arrogant away from worshipping Allah, the more your need, dependence, reliance, attachment, captivation by other things besides Allah. Right? So that's why this is, as Shaykh al-Fawzan explains, because one person cannot achieve all of those things by himself. And this is why at the end of the day, from history, empires crumble. Empires vanish, empires are destroyed, right? They take decades or centuries to build, and they can crumble in an instance, right? And this is because, like the tyrant, he places reliance upon all of these things, and then these things just crumble in front of him, because it's Allah Azza wa Jal who is the one who controls all affairs. Nothing is outside of His reach, and when the heart relies upon other things, they are never everlasting. They expire, they come to an end, and the only thing that remains is iman in Allah and taqwa of Allah, piety, obedience to Allah. That brings along with it security, safety, affluence, things like that, contentedness, and so on and so forth. So this is the explanation of that point, that every mushrik, every mustakbir, wa kullu mustakbirin fahuwa mushrik. Every arrogant, proud person is by necessity a mushrik as well. And likewise, every time a person increases in his arrogance and his pride, then he increases also in his shirk, in his associationism, in his heart's attachment and reliance, dependence of other things besides him. So, as the Shaykh says, he goes on to make this point, and inshallah what we'll do, because we've come to a junction in the text where the next point is going to take longer to discuss, what we'll do is we'll stop at this specific point today, finishing on this point, because the point that follows next is simply that the only way that any person can be free of need from anyone in the creation is if he is a person of Tawheed who singles out Allah in worship, right? To not make your heart attached to anything or rely upon anything. To achieve this is that you are a worshipper of Allah. Your heart is only attached to Allah, right? And so your heart is not attached in an unhealthy way to other things besides Him. It can't be captivated by other things besides Him. So we know that this is the only way you can be free of need from the creation. How can you make yourself free of need from the creation? It is to fill your heart with Tawheed, Iman, the Uboodiyyah of Allah, servitude to Allah. And, whereas the more you are arrogant, the more you are full of pride, the more you have to depend on yourself and others besides Allah, and the greater and greater you slip into captivity and enslavement to other than Allah. Right? So it's important for us to see this connection between these two things, that the more you are enslaved to Allah Azza wa Jal, and the more you are reliant and worshipping and so on and so forth, all of those meanings of Iman and so on and so forth, right? The less you are enslaved by other things besides Him. You're not enslaved by your lusts, you're not enslaved by your desires, not enslaved by material possessions like you see in the hadith that we discussed many lessons ago. Wretched is the worshipper of the dinar, wretched is the worshipper of the dirham, right? Speaking about the one who basically he's attached to wealth, right? And he's tied to wealth, and his heart is infatuated with wealth. And so there's a competition in the heart between love of Allah and love of these things, which comes in the way of his obedience to Allah, right? So the way you make yourself completely free from enslavement to these other things is by way of Iman, Taqwa, Uboodiyyah. And the further a person is away from this and more arrogant, the more he is captivated by other than Allah, and and the more he falls into shirk and its various manifestations. So that's the essence of what we discussed today, inshallah, and we'll stop at this point. In what follows, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he's going to discuss again the same point, that the only way you can escape all of this is to be an abd of Allah, a servant of Allah, upon ubudiyyah, And then after this, he's going to speak about some of the people of the book, like the Christians, the Jews, and things like that, and how and why they did not accept the truth because of pride and arrogance. So not only is it the example of Fir'aun, he was proud and arrogant, but so were the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, when the truth came to them. And likewise, the polytheists, the pagan Arabs, right? All of these groups of people were proud and arrogant away from the truth. So we'll stop at this point, inshallah ta'ala, and we'll continue in the next lesson. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.